Have you ever longed to relive your past, but with your current mind? I stumbled upon something that did just that. What was lurking there, though, was something only a nightmare could conjure up. That was the first thing Michael David Knight, who appeared to be in his early 30s, told the Oneida, Tennessee authorities after being arrested and interviewed on April 24th, 1996 for breaking and entering. This is his story. For years after my parents were murdered by my uncle, I longed to go back into my body when I was young and relive those days, when they were still alive and I didn't have a care in the world. It was 1956 and I was 15 years old when my parents were brutally murdered by my mom's brother while I was at my friend's house. I came home that evening to find it surrounded by police cars as my uncle was being escorted down the steps. I'll never forget the look he gave me. That was a devastating turning point in my life. I was an only child and was sent away to live with my grandparents in Kingston Springs, Tennessee. I stayed there until I graduated high school, then moved to the big city to attend a university. Once I finished, I got an office job that quickly started sucking the soul from my body. I was doing everything I'd been told to do: go to school, get a job, and buy a house. Yet, I hated life. It was August 3rd, 1970, the day I said, screw this. I was sitting at my desk going through the day's paperwork when the thought hit me: if this is going to be my life for the next 40 years, then I would rather die. I immediately stood up, walked out, hopped in my '65 Buick Riviera, and drove home. Once there, I packed some food and stuff I'd need, then drove to the big South Fork area of the Appalachians. I'd been camping there multiple times over the years with my grandparents and took a liking to the area. As I made the long drive, a lot of thoughts went through my head, mostly about my parents and how I longed to see their faces again. I had no real plan. I knew I just needed to get away from everything. When I made it to the mountains, I drove until I ran out of gas, and it was late, so I made the decision to sleep in my car. The sounds of birds echoing through the forest woke me as it suddenly all became clear. I was going to leave everything behind and live in the mountains. For how long? I didn't know. I never gave it much thought. All I knew was I wasn't going back and didn't care what happened. I loaded up my backpack with what I was going to take, took one last look at my car keys, and tossed them on the driver's seat. Excitement surged through me like I hadn't felt in a long time as I turned and began hiking into the unknown. Like I said, I'd been to certain parts of the Big South Fork, but never to this area. Again, it didn't matter. I hiked for most of the day before coming to a spot near a river that looked good to me. Obviously, I needed water, but hadn't figured out what I was going to do for food long term. Sure, I had enough for a few days, but after that, I'd have to make do or starve. 3 days later, I ran out of food, and by the fifth day, I knew I had to figure out something, so I decided to go out scavenging. I spent the better part of the day looking for things to eat, but found nothing. As evening grew near, I crested a hill and noticed some lights through the trees not too far from me. As I got closer, I could see there were multiple cabins, some with their lights on and some that were dark. I figured the dark ones were empty and decided to break in to see if I could find food. The first cabin I broke into was like hitting the jackpot. Their pantry was loaded with dried goods and canned food. I loaded my backpack to the brim and decided to sleep there until morning. I also took some essentials and such, like extra blankets and some knives. I made sure I awoke before first light so I could leave without being seen. When I made it back to camp, I figured it was only about a 2 hour hike, which was good. Far enough away, but not too far, it'd be unreasonable to go once a week or as needed. This routine went on for several years and life was good except for the harsh winters. Those were a real struggle and seemed to never end. I did eventually find another set of cabins I pillaged when needed, so I wasn't hitting the same ones that often. Over time, I forgot what month or year it was, so I can't tell you exactly what day it was when I broke into the cabin that changed the course of my life. I'd broken into this cabin 2 other times over the years, and both times it was exactly the same inside, except there was always a new stock of food and supplies. This time, though, I noticed an old, black leather nameless book sitting on the kitchen table. Of course, I was curious, as I didn't have much entertainment except for the books I'd taken throughout the years. As I sat down and opened it, the first page had the word Praeteritum written on it. As I scrolled through the pages, I could see they were all blank, except for the second page, which was written in a language I didn't know. I remember stuttering out loud through the first paragraph when suddenly I was sitting in my third grade classroom watching my teacher talking and writing on the chalkboard. I immediately tried standing up from my desk but couldn't make my body move. I could see and hear everything, but it was as if I was only a spectator. Not long after, we were excused for recess, and as I walked through the door going outside, I saw my reflection in the door's glass. It was me, but 8 years old me. This left me bewildered as thoughts raced through my mind. Am I dreaming? Am I dead? What in Lord's name is going on? I also noticed something was slightly off. Looking through my younger self's eyes was like gazing through a mask. It didn't take long, though, before I was in a complete state of bliss as I got to see, smell, and touch things from one of the happiest periods of my life. Running around the playground with my friends was like being wrapped in a warm blanket after being out in the freezing cold. As the day unfolded, I remembered exactly what was going to happen next because coincidentally, before coming to the cabin, I thought about this very day. Since I've been living as a recluse, I did a lot of reminiscing about my youth. This was the day my girlfriend Brittany and I planned on meeting out by the stream so we could have our first kiss, but I'd ended up chickening out. As I got older, I'd always wished I would have had the courage to meet her there. When we were excused for the last recess, and just like I remembered, I snuck over to the side of the building and peered around as I watched Brittany heading to the stream. I wanted to force myself to go as I thought, just go, just go. And for a split second, it seemed as if my younger self was listening to me as I took a step forward and seemed to hesitate longer than before. After she disappeared into the trees, I stood up straight, about to turn, heading to the football field, when it felt like someone or something was behind us, watching us. This is odd, I thought, as I didn't remember feeling this back in the day. As we slowly turned around, I saw something that not only ended the bliss I was feeling, but scared me something awful. And I've never been one to scare easily, so this rattled me. On the opposite side of the school grounds, a ways off, was a man, dressed in red. His face was disfigured, distorted to the point I couldn't make it out. He stood there, staring at us, not moving. This really creeped me out, as I clearly didn't remember him, and for sure would have because of how out of place he was. He clearly did not belong there. My younger self didn't notice as I ran to the field, joining my friends in the football game. Every now and then, I'd get glances of him, standing there, never moving. When school finished, I ran outside to catch the bus home, and thankfully, he wasn't there. I couldn't stop thinking about him, though, as I stared out the window on the ride home. As my home came into sight and I ran inside to greet my mother, I forgot all about him. I reveled in pure joy as she hugged me and kept thinking I never want to let go of her. The rest of the day played out just like I remembered, and seeing my father again was unforgettably surreal. That night, as my mother put me to bed, I wondered what was going to happen next, still not fully believing this was actually happening. In the split second I closed my eyes to sleep, the next second I was awakened to the sound of birds chirping with me still in the chair, the book at my feet. It was already light outside, and I knew I couldn't leave until it was dark. I just prayed the owners wouldn't randomly show up. I reached down, picking up the book as I asked aloud, "What is this thing?" I thought about leaving it there, but the idea of being able to go back again, even if it was just a dream, was way too tempting, so I stuffed it into my backpack. As I hiked back to camp that night, I was obsessing over what had happened. It literally felt like I'd been in heaven. In the back of my mind was a nagging thought of the disfigured man in red. Whatever worries I had about him, though, were squashed by the joy I'd felt. The following morning, when it got light, I noticed things in my camp had changed. Some varmints had made a mess and my stuff was covered in a layer of dust, like I hadn't been there in a while, but I'd only been gone 24 hours, or so I thought. As I sat there eating breakfast that morning, I stared at the book, debating if I should even open it again. My thoughts then wandered back to a summer day when I was 10 years old. I remember my friends coming by early that morning to fetch me so we could go catch frogs and snakes down at the pond, not too far from my house. The thought of reliving that day overtook me as I grabbed the book and began reading the first paragraph. Like before, I was suddenly taken back. only this time I was sitting at the kitchen table watching my mother humming a song as she cooked breakfast. It didn't take long to realize whatever day I thought about was the day I'd relive after reading the book. After taking my last bite, there was a knock on the door. I bolted from my chair as I greeted my friends. Seeing them again made me want to hug them as I'd missed them both very much. As we hopped on our bikes and rode down the street with the sun on our backs and the wind in our hair, I felt nothing but happiness. When we made it to the pond, we didn't waste any time running and jumping in as we began hunting for frogs. I'd gone under the water several times, and as I surfaced to take a breath, my mind screamed out, "No, it can't be!" There, on the bank, on the far side of the pond, staring at me, was the man in red. I waited for my younger self and friends to notice, but they continued playing as if he didn't exist. I now knew, without a doubt, only I could see him. One thing I took note of as the day wore on: he was closer to me this time than he was at the school, and he seemed darker. I could also see his face more clearly, and it was more horrific than the first time, something I would have never dreamt up on my worst day. As dusk settled in, we knew it was time to go, so we hopped on our bikes and rode home. On the ride home, I couldn't get his face out of my mind. Something wrong was happening. Again, my worries left as I ran inside my house and was greeted by my parents as they both hugged me before sitting down to dinner. My younger self spilled the details of the day as I looked on at them, not wanting the day to end. As I lay down to sleep that night and my mother kissed my forehead, I was crying in my mind, knowing I'd most likely wake up back at camp. Like before, once I closed my eyes, I was startled awake, this time to the cold wind blowing on my face as the book fell off my lap. My stomach growled loudly, letting me know I was starving. It felt like I hadn't eaten in days, and I was dying of thirst. It felt like I'd been gone for longer than a day, which would explain why things in camp had changed so much before. After reading, I picked up the book and began flipping through the pages, and noticed at the very end, two of the pages had turned completely black. A dark, eerie feeling overcame me as I was certain they weren't like that before. I gave deep thought to many things that day and decided what was happening had to be real. I also made the decision to only use it every couple of days. If I didn't control myself, I'd continue going nonstop and would literally starve to death or die of dehydration. The back of my mind was screaming at me not to do it again, but the feelings I got from going were just too strong. I also wondered if the man in red had been there all along and I just couldn't see him for some reason. It went on like that for almost a year, I'd say. I'd go back every 2 to 3 days, more so in the colder months. During that time, the cabins I'd raid seemed to dramatically change inside, almost like time had continued on for everyone but me. Also, each time I'd relive the past, another page at the end of the book would turn black. I could see I was running out of pages, wondering what would happen when I ran out. I was so caught up each time I relived, as I began calling it, I dismissed the fact the man in red was now a much darker shade and had taken on the form of something that didn't resemble a human anymore. Instead of being in front of me, he was now behind me and getting closer each time. It was a cold, bitter day as I laid in my tent when I picked up the book and noticed there were no more white, empty pages. I frantically began flipping through the book in a panic, worried it was all over, when suddenly I was standing in the basement of my house. It was frighteningly silent for what seemed like forever. Then, without warning, I heard murmuring upstairs and assumed it was my parents. It got louder and quickly turned to shouting, then what sounded like fighting and someone running down the hallway. My knees buckled as the hairs on my neck stood up. I didn't recall this day, and something was different. It wasn't like I was looking through a mask anymore, and I seemed to have control over my body, which had never happened. The shouting abruptly stopped, and I knew I had to go upstairs to see what was going on. I quietly walked over to the bottom of the stairs and took a deep breath. As I put my foot down on the first step, I heard a strange, faint noise that made me pause. "Dig deep, man," I whispered aloud as I forced myself to take another step, then another. As I approached the door at the top of the stairs, time seemed to slow down to a crawl. I reached out to grab the doorknob, but my hand was numb. I didn't know if something was wrong with me or if it was out of fear of not knowing what was going to happen next. I then grabbed the doorknob with both hands and was finally able to turn it as I slowly opened the door leading into the hallway. Before going any further, I looked down and noticed drops of blood leading down to the bedrooms. I thought about running back into the basement, but I'd be trapped down there. I also thought about calling out to my parents, but decided against that. As I was about to take a step further, the thing that had once been the man in red appeared at the end of the hallway. Whatever it had been morphing into, it now looked complete. It started coming towards me when suddenly there was a knock on the front door, as I heard my uncle call out to my parents. I quickly turned to head back into the basement when I felt something impel me. This sent me tumbling down the stairs, and I must have got knocked out because the next thing I remember was waking up in the tent with my sleeping bag covered in blood. Something had in fact been thrust through my back, leaving a 4-inch scar I carry to this day. I laid there bleeding, debating whether or not to go for help or accept whatever fate had for me next. I decided to stay, did my best to stop the bleeding, and succeeded, as I'm still here. As I recovered, I had a lot of time to think and came to the realization that maybe my uncle didn't murder my parents after all. Over the years, it always bothered me because my mother and him were the best of friends, and to me, growing up, he didn't have a bad bone in his body. The police told me they'd gotten into a heated argument and he brutally killed them. There was always a sliver of doubt in my mind, though. Remembering the look he gave me as he was escorted down the steps makes sense now. He was in as much shock as I was. I think he just gave up on life after that and didn't fight back, defending himself. Losing his only sister must have broken his heart. Did he see the thing I saw? Was it still there when he went inside? If he did, he never mentioned it to anyone. Who would believe him anyway? We'll never know, as he hung himself several years after being imprisoned. After that, I never opened the book again, which I'm sure you found at my camp, and now you're telling me it's 1996? How can that be? I should be in my 50s, but I don't look or feel a day over 30. Michael was caught sleeping in one of the cabins, and the police were dispatched. After his arrest, they were able to verify who he was. A search of his camp was performed, and they did in fact find the black book exactly as he described. The first page had the word Praeteritum written on it, the second page with a paragraph of text, and the remaining pages blacked out. The book has been reviewed by multiple experts, and no one can say what language the paragraph of text is written in. Michael spent 6 months in jail for breaking and entering. While there, the owner of the cabin he'd found the black book in paid him a visit, lasting several hours. To this day, no one knows what they discussed. After his release, he has since disappeared. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.